Some of the highest quality guitars in the world that were strummed by some pretty famous fingers were handmade by a man who lived in Wichita, Kansas. A lot of musicians say the Smith guitar is one of the most well-constructed guitars ever made. Ralph Smith began making guitars in the 1960s, and some of them are still being played to this very day. This is the sound of a Smith guitar. What was your dad like?
Perfectionist. He was not one that you wanted to tell him you couldn't do something. That's what kind of got him into a lot of stuff.
There's no doubt about it. When Doug Smith's dad, Ralph, or as the family called him, Gilbert, decided to build something, he really built it from scratch.
Started out building two-cycle racing engines. Cast his own blocks, made his own pistons, sleeves, cranks, rods. He even built a prop machine for making his own props. Then he got off into building pulse jets and go-karts. And then the desire was music and guitars and everything else. And
really innovative guitars.
I'm not sure if somebody told him he couldn't build one or if he just got the strange idea to build one. But it went from there. The very first one was a 12-string solid body electric.
The family held on to it for several years, but then they sold it, and though they've tried, they haven't been able to track it down since.
He loved to get involved with virtually anything that was mechanical or whatever. And if he didn't understand it, he would find out. He would do some research and do his own digging.
Smith's guitars were so impressive that they began to attract a lot of attention. Word spread as far as Nashville.
Because what got Joe Maphis' attention was the 18-string guitar, and that was the thing that he came in town to see. But sometime shortly after that, he wound up using the original, the prototype, which they put a pick guard on it with his name on it. It's on display here. That was his till we finished his.
Listen to the difference. Here's what a regular 6-string guitar sounds like. This is what a Smith 18-string sounds like.
An 18 has sounds like you're playing a 12-string with a heart behind it.
Most people don't know that 18-string guitars exist. They sort of end at 12 typically.
The first 18-string Smith built was back in 1967.
The guitars, when he started those and everything else, especially the 18, he was concerned about the structural ability of the guitar. After he built the first one and everything else, or actually prior to building the first one, he talked to a structural engineer from Boeing at that time. We actually found the structural reports that he completed in 1968, I believe it was, and they're well built.
Yes, they are. In fact, this one is still in mint condition 45 years later.
Yeah, I mean, the prototype has had strings on it since, I believe, late 60s, and that's a lot of strain on a guitar. All those strings, you know, you got 18 strings of pressure pulling on it, and you also have a cutaway on the guitar where you have material missing, which is going to take away from the structure, but it has an effect.
Once you hear an 18, you're able to pick it out of any song that's used in. So, no doubt about it.
Smith only built 11 of them, including the prototype.
A gentleman from WSU in the music department several years ago, after a lot of research, claimed that there's 86 different tunings for the 18.
The Maphis family actually became close friends and spent a lot of time here at the Smiths' house in Wichita. Joe Maphis wasn't the only famous person to pick up a Smith guitar. Gordon Terry played one too. Smith's 18-string guitar uses 6 courses, or sets of 3 strings, which are played and tuned like a standard 6-string guitar.
They're very novel, not just for the 18 strings, but also the way the neck attaches to the body is very innovative.
Smith's son Doug says Smith guitars are easily recognizable.
The main thing that you'll notice on the Smith guitars is the cutaway. Dad had a patent on a full relief neck that you could actually play all 24 frets that were on the fingerboard. The cutaway, being a fairly sharp point, is very identifiable. It actually has a thumb relief on the back side of the neck. That was something he had a patent on for a while.
Which basically, if you can get all the way up into here if you want to play all the way up to the 24. Most people don't play that high, but it's available. It's something that's there if you want it.
And the 18-string sort of propelled them into legendary status too. No one really built 18s before or since, with very few exceptions. What's amazing is that these guitars actually are very playable after 30, 40 years of existence. So it's amazing they're playable in the first place.
Well, this one is being assembled with zebra sides and back, everything else. It is on a design that Dad came up with himself. He always felt that if you want a Gibson, you buy a Gibson. If you want a Martin, you buy a Martin. So he came up with his own design. He doesn't like copying anybody else's stuff. Not real fond of people copying his stuff. These are all original molds, original everything.
How long do you usually take him from start to finish?
We've been trying to find the information on that, and the best I can tell, actual construction time at that time was around 30 to 36 hours. Actual construction time, sometimes more, depending on the type of materials, what was to be done with it.
Smith spent a lot of time on the road with his job, so sometimes it would be months before a guitar was finished. Smith also designed a lot of one-of-a-kind instruments for people. He designed this 3-neck guitar for this man, who used it to perform in schools.
One for a gentleman named Marseille Reyes was actually 2 guitars that were cut and put together as a double neck, and then on top of that was a 14-string Bandoria, so the bottom was a 4-string bass, the center one was a 12-string guitar, and the top one was a 14-string Bandoria.
This apple-shaped guitar was custom made for Clem Appleknocker, who used it in his comedy show.
He was a person that enjoyed, I think he enjoyed doing things for other people. I think it was a pride of his, and it showed. He never would quit. You get somebody's mind, and don't bother him because he's not changing until he's done. And he was more than willing to build anything different. I think he got an enjoyment out of doing something unusual.
Smith actually played the guitar himself. Coming up after the break, we'll tell you when he started. You're watching It's All Good. As we told you before the break, Ralph Smith made guitars for a lot of different performers, but he could also play himself. In fact, he began playing guitar when he was still in his teens and received this Gibson J45 on his 16th birthday.
He was really inspired by the instrument, but on top of that, he was what you might, I think, term a genius, a mechanical engineering genius. And that's reflected in his work and the design of his guitars.
Museum director Eric Kale tracked down a lot of these guitars you see in this exhibit.
It was not an easy task, although these guitars are known far and wide. They've been featured in books, but they've always, there hasn't been much history researched on it.
Smith moved to Wichita in 1951 to work in the aircraft industry, but his real love was designing and building.
Basically did not have a high school education for several years. And I think that gave him the motive to actually exceed even more.
While most of his guitars were made in his home shop, not all of them were. In 1971, Smith opened a guitar manufacturing facility here in Hayesville, Kansas. It employed 12 workers who produced around 75 guitars before the company closed its doors a year and a half later.
And I think Dad enjoyed the idea of working pretty much by himself. He's, like I said, a perfectionist. Most people enjoy working by themselves. Hand assemble, hand fit, and everything else.
Closing the plant didn't stop Smith from making guitars, though. He continued to build them in his home shop, and soon all the rest of the family got involved. Doug Smith began helping out when he was about 10 years old.
The first guitar that I built was a classic that I built when it seemed like I was 14, 15. I can't remember when I built it. Made the mistake of selling it in high school. Kind of wish I'd have kept it. What was interesting about it, it was a design all my own. The bracing was completely different, and the wood off the top was a piece of wood that came off of the sideboard of a truck that my grandfather and my dad drove to California when my dad was a kid. And I had to carve my own neck and everything from scratch, and it was very rewarding to get it finished up. So.
But it wasn't just making a guitar that the father and son shared.
We didn't spend a lot of time doing sports together or anything like that, but when it came to mechanics and stuff, there was a lot of understanding there.
Doug's son and Ralph's grandson, Tim, says it's always been a dream of his to follow in his grandfather's footsteps.
You know, and then as you grow up, you hear stories. You know, we used to build guitars, and, you know, so as long as I can remember, all I would ever say is, let's build some guitars, you know. I feel pretty grateful that a lot of the creativity and ingenuity, you know, in this family has been passed down. And so sometimes, you know, I would just get out a notepad and start, you know, coming up with guitar designs. And because you know when you dive into something, even if you don't know what you're getting into, you're eventually gonna figure it out. You know?
And Tim and his father are figuring it out. The Smith guitar story isn't over yet. Doug and Tim are starting to make guitars again using Ralph's original patterns, tools, and materials.
Every step of the way, we've kind of taken steps back and, you know, okay, what would be the best way to do this? If we were going to produce more, what would be the most efficient way to do this?
Right
now, they're in the process of putting Ralph's shop back together again.
Basically, everything else with the liner, it starts out as a solid piece of material. We actually get materials we have and everything else are 1 inch thick by 6 inches wide by about 12 foot long, all out of spruce. We sometimes pick different grades depending on soft or a little harder wood, depending on what we're looking for. These have all been cut by hand. Most of these were cut back in the late 60s, early 70s. Still have several of those left over.
We might come across something in the shop for the guitars, and we don't know what it is. And it's kind of neat when you kind of look at stuff and you brainstorm and you kind of throw it around in your mind and, oh, I bet I know what that is. And sure enough, you know, you kind of feel like, you know, we all think a lot alike, and we can kind of reverse engineer something if we come across something that doesn't make any sense to us. We try to tear it down, you know, in our mind, and then, okay, well, why would he do this, or why was it done this way, or, you know, and then eventually I think I know, and then we test it and then find out, you know.
Tim Smith has spent the past year making his first guitar.
Well, when I did the pearl on this one, I wanted something that looked different. I didn't want it to look like, you know, something else that I'd seen. So it's kind of a, you know, a buzzsaw lick, which basically just programmed this on the NC machine for cutting this out, and also for cutting the channel down the top. And there's a black strip of wood in between 2 strips of abalone pearl.
How does it feel to know you're kind of carrying on a legacy?
That's pretty neat. You know, it kind of is one of the things that can help drive you. It's just having, you feel like, you know, you've got that, kind of got that behind you.
But the braces and everything else on it were actually put together and worked with a structural engineer to come up with pretty much the design on the brace and make sure it holds. But one's been sitting in the attic for 30-some years, and it will not be used for anything because it's not the quality we want.
This is something that I've wanted to do since a kid. And if the business, you know, even if it never really went and got huge, I would still be happy. based on the way things have kind of been going just in these early stages with the kind of interest that we have had, I would say it may be safe to say this might take off.
This next generation of guitar makers is making every effort to keep the legacy alive. And every step of the way, they're making sure they live up to Ralph's high standards.
This whole family is a perfectionist family. So there was discussions over that. Is a nice way to put it.
Although Gibson made an 18-string guitar for John Denver to play, no manufacturer has ever attempted to mass produce one. Coming up on It's All Good, we'll tell you where they make the best milkshakes in the state. Stay with us.